From Eyewitness News, this is Newsmakers.
It's been a bad stretch for Rhode Island lately. This week, something completely different: optimism. Two entrepreneurs have been selected by the Rhode Island Foundation for a six-figure fellowship designed to improve things around here. Both winners are hoping to do their part to jumpstart the economy and create jobs. Our guests for the first half of Newsmakers, Innovation Fellow Allan Tear and Rhode Island Foundation CEO Neil Steinberg. Then, for the first time, America's Cup racing will be held inside Narragansett Bay, hosted by a familiar city to the historic races, Newport. This week on the second half of Newsmakers, get ready for the America's Cup World Series, coming to Rhode Island next month. Good morning, welcome to Newsmakers. I'm Tim White. Our guests for the second half: Executive Director for the RIEDC, Keith Stokes, and Executive Director for America's Cup Rhode Island, Paul Harden. Joining me on the panel this week, WPRI.com reporter Ted Nisi. Good morning, everybody.
Morning.
Good morning, Neil.
Morning.
Alan, thank you for joining us on the program. We touched on it briefly in the open. Neil, if you could just give us briefly explain what the Rhode Island Innovation Fellowship is.
Sure. About a year ago, wonderful Rhode Island philanthropist John and Letitia Carter, who partner with the Rhode Island Foundation on their philanthropy, had an idea and an inspiration, and that was to spur innovation, to inspire Rhode Islanders to come up with new ideas to solve Rhode Island issues or address Rhode Island opportunities. It was that simple, and we put out a call, and we had a tremendous response over the last several months that resulted in us selecting the first two Rhode Island Innovation Fellows.
And Allan Tear is one of those fellows.
Yes.
Alan, what was your big idea that got the fellowship?
Well, it was a modest proposal to create a startup revolution in Rhode Island. And I'm a technology entrepreneur. Since I moved here 10 years ago, I've been working with the technology community to create first a community of entrepreneurs that then were connected to each other, that shared resources, and that eventually started companies. And we created something called Beta Spring, which now mints dozens of high-growth technology startups every year. But when I moved here, I started to see these pockets of talent that we have in Rhode Island that no one else around the country has. World-class talent in arts and design, in food and beverage, in social impact, in advanced manufacturing. And I didn't see that same kind of startup activity in those clusters. The entrepreneurs weren't connected together. High-growth companies weren't coming out of that talent. And I wanted to take the same thing that had worked for us in the technology community and figure out a way to apply it to these high-growth sectors where we have such incredible potential in Rhode Island. So I feel very fortunate to have this opportunity to take the fellowship and use it to spur.
And how is that? How are you going to use the money when it comes down to the nitty-gritty?
Sure. So there's really three steps that I've seen work previously that I'm hoping to apply to these high potential clusters of talent. So the first one is we'll be using the money to figure out where the entrepreneurs are and what the high potential, who the high potential people are, because it all really starts with people. And we'll be bringing them together in various ways to connect with each other, give them platforms to share resources, whether those be talented hires, whether they be customer opportunities, whether they're tools that they can share. Once you start to do that, the energy level increases because these entrepreneurs realize that they're not on an island by themselves. And then what I've seen happen in other areas is those entrepreneurs say, oh, I'm going to work on a specific initiative. So for example, in technology, something called Providence Geeks rose out of that energy and became the place where once a month all the technology entrepreneurs came together. Right? There's no reason why there shouldn't be something like that for art and design or for advanced manufacturing. And as that happened, that all set the stage for then creating startup factories So that's what Beta Spring is. It's really a startup factory, and there's a chance for more startup factories in those untapped sectors, ways where we take all that potential energy and we actually turn them into real companies.
I thought the idea for this was so interesting, Neil, to just sort of, it was very wide open, the application process, sort of what people could pitch to you. Can you tell us a little about the number of applications you received and sort of the variety?
Sure, and one of the reasons it was different, Ted, is because it was new. We started with a blank piece of paper, and the Carters, when they had the vision, also said they're willing to fail. So we were looking for a wide range of ideas about almost anything. We had 438 applications.
Did that surprise you?
It shocked us.
Yeah.
We didn't really know how many, but there was an outpouring from people all across the state, some from out of state, who had always wanted to put down on paper or express their ideas for something. And so the process was, we had a selection committee that got together, reviewed the 438. We winnowed that down to a next group of 32, and then we asked that 32, those individuals, to submit a much more robust application and a video so they could tell us their story. We then took those 32 and got them down to 7 finalists, and then interviewed.
Sounds like America's Idol.
It was a little like that, I guess. And the final 7 we interviewed over 2 days, and it was extremely positive and uplifting. And I'd said before that in the entire process, from the 438, 32, or the 7, nobody complained about taxes being too high. Nobody said that utility costs are out of whack. Nobody said we can't do something here because we're 49th on some report. It was just all very positive, unique, opportunistic ideas.
Let's talk about that. And I want you to weigh in there. You pointed out you're the founder of Beta Spring. I think I read somewhere you were described as a serial entrepreneur, kind of like that. True or false? Rhode Island is difficult to start and keep a business running in.
False.
Why?
Well, starting a company, especially in the early days, from when you first have the idea to where you put it on the ground, you find resources and you find customers, right? Really has much more to do with the entrepreneur and the capabilities that they bring around themselves, and much less to do with the outside environment, right? The highest growth companies in our country were started during recessions. So it's good things start when things are bad. As companies grow and they become more established, then you can make an argument that established companies have a harder time with the business environment in a state, right? Because they're more affected by external factors. But in the early days, most of a startup's success or failure really have to do with the entrepreneur and the resources that they're able to gather around themselves.
Do you think those concerns then are overblown, or do you think that we might sometimes be looking at the wrong factors in terms of what could make Rhode Island? Because what you're saying there, it sounds like, is it's less about when you start the business than if you keep it and decide to grow it here. You know, not everyone does what like Charlie Kroll did and keep it in the state and keep going. We know people who leave.
Well, I think there's no doubt that in Rhode Island we have factors that make it difficult for some businesses to succeed and expand. I'm not sure that they are the determining factor. So I do think the coverage of that is overblown. But the good news for us is that if we choose to play a different game, if we choose to play a game of, high growth startups that mainly sell their goods and services outside of the state and bring dollars back to the state, that we can compete on a national and global level.
That's not a brick and mortar type of operation we're talking about, correct?
You may have brick and mortar as part of what you do, but there's no doubt that we can't see Rhode Island as a closed loop system. We only have 1 million people. We can't spend our time just selling things to each other, right? The way that we're going to succeed, the way Rhode Island has always succeeded over its history, is by taking its great ideas, its goods, and its services, and taking them to the globe.
Neil, John Carter supplied the money very generously to this project.
Correct.
He made his money as a successful manufacturer here in Rhode Island. He moved his company here in 1960. Do you think he would have moved his company here in 2012?
Sure. He was responding to industries then. So for instance, it was the jewelry industry that first got him with the machine that he invented here. There are probably others, but I think it was an opportunity. He sold worldwide, to Alan's point. Variety of industries. Smart business people succeed in recessions. Smart business people succeed in great times. And there are a lot of different factors, not all the ones that we key in.
Yet this state lags the country. This morning, we tape on a Friday morning, the unemployment rate is 11.1%. It went up.
Yep.
What do you make of it?
We didn't migrate from that old manufacturing, large corporate environment. It's not a corporate environment in Rhode Island anymore. It is more entrepreneurial. It's the base of people that we have. We do see people, we at the foundation see people at all ages, whether it's getting out of college or in their 50s, that want to be in Rhode Island. They put a dot on a piece of paper. They want to be by the water. They want to be near New York. They want to be near Boston. They want to be near culture. They want to be near higher education. Not to say that it's all perfect, certainly, but there are just so many factors. And successful people, and the Carters are a good example, they're here. They're still here.
Go ahead, Alan. You were going to say something.
I was going to say, if you look at, so a study came out recently from the Kauffman Foundation, which really focuses on entrepreneurship, and they looked at data from the past 25 years in the U.S. And what they found was that all new net job creation was from companies that were 5 years or less in age. So what that essentially meant was companies that were 5 years or greater, some companies hired, other companies laid off. It was a wash. All of our net job creation on a year-over-year basis came from companies that were 5 years or less, startups. And for a couple decades in Rhode Island, we forgot that lesson. The story of Rhode Island until the 80s was a story of companies starting up. The industry stalwarts that we think of today, Hasbro, CVS, G-Tech, APC, those were all entrepreneurial companies that were started here and sold to the globe. And then we kind of had a couple decades where we lost the thread. And I think it's time to come back to that. But it's going to take some time. You don't just snap your fingers and suddenly those startups become a huge hiring sector. We've got to get that wheel started again.
I'm curious, Neil, in your career path, you were a banker. You were at Fleet when that had a big presence here, and then you went to Brown University. Now you're at the Rhode Island Foundation. Your own career seems to sort of track how Rhode Island, the migration in our own economy. What do you think is next? Do you see what will be the career path for someone who maybe is now where you were when you were starting in Fleet and moving up the ranks and going forward? Yeah,
and as I said before, I think that the corporate environment has changed, so it's different moving up the ranks in the big corporations, and so I think you'll see more going back and forth, large corporation, entrepreneurs, education, nonprofit. There's a lot of opportunities. A lot of these ideas that we got were not all startup companies. They were to improve languages in the schools, nutrition in the state. They were around a lot of different things. And I think entrepreneurial cultures aren't just little tiny companies. They can be in bigger companies. As Alan said, they can grow, but I think it's different. And I don't, I can't predict the future, but it's not as simple as move up in your career in a large company and get your gold watch at the end of 25 years. That just doesn't go on anymore. There's a lot more moving back and forth of talent.
Well, gentlemen, we're out of time. I hope you are both willing to come back because we had a few more questions.
Absolutely.
Sure.
Good. Well, you look like a jerk.
And
Alan,
what's the timeline? When will you be able to say, hey, we're doing some stuff with the money?
We're going to get started this summer.
Okay, great. Allan Tear, congratulations on the fellowship, and Neil Steinberg from the Rhode Island Foundation. Thank you for joining us on the program. And when we come back, America's Cup returns to Newport with the World Series event. Keith Stokes, Paul Harden join us on the second half of Newsmakers. Welcome back to Newsmakers. I'm Tim White. To my right, WPRI.com reporter Ted Nesi, and we welcome on the second half Executive Director for the EDC, Keith Stokes, and Executive Director for America's Cup, Rhode Island, Paul Harden. Paul, let's start with you. Let's get our sailing on for the second half, something positive. Give viewers the basics. Dates of the events, dates of the actual racing, which are two different things, and where they should go.
The event starts June 23rd with a Youth Regatta by Sail Newport. So they're coordinating a statewide, they're coordinating a statewide regatta for various youth sailing programs throughout the state. The actual America's Cup event starts with practice sailing on the 26th. They have formal practice racing on the 27th, and then the actual racing for the points starts on the 28th.
And lasts how long?
Till July 1st.
Okay. And from what I'm reading, Fort Adams is the place.
Fort Adams is the place. Unlike other venues they've had for the America's Cup World Series, both the event village and the technical area where the team bases are set up will all be right there at Fort Adams. So they'll be right next to each other. You can walk from the technical area to the event village. Both areas are open to the public. Oftentimes, in the morning, the public will come down and watch them launching the boats out there. They can look into the team bases and see them working on the boats. And then you can go into the event village where there's food, concessions, the viewing stands. There's an exhibit by Louis Vuitton on the history of the America's Cup. So there's a lot of other activities. There's a URI, Oceanography Schools, putting up an exploration center there, looking at different programs they do and how they work with the ocean. So there'll be a lot of other activities going on besides just the racing.
Keith, some might growl at the expenditure of $1.2 million in improvements at Fort Adams for this event, especially in a time of austerity. Address that. Why is it important to spend that kind of money on Fort Adams?
Well, first of all, Fort Adams has been a public asset for 2 centuries. It was a federal fortification system of the United States Army, and then over the last 40 years, it has been a state asset run by our Department of Environmental Management, and it's one of a number of great public state oceanfront parks that we have within this state. Unfortunately, we've never had the long-term strategy or capacity to make the necessary public improvements to provide better public access and utilization of that site or most of our parks. So the money that's being expended to Fort Adams State Park is coming from our state capital improvement plan. These are dollars already budgeted and set aside for the specific purpose of accelerating improvements of capital assets. So we are simply taking advantage of a world-class international event, siting it in Rhode Island, siting it properly at a fort in the middle of Newport Harbor, and accelerating public improvements that were already on the drawing board for a number of years before.
What are you going to see for improvements at Fort Adams?
The types of improvements are already underway. We're in a second of a 3-year improvement plan is that we're improving public access, particularly the fort itself. There's already been significant improvements of public access, handicap access, health, safety, restructuring of the fort systems itself. On the land side, the parking lots are being restriped and restructured. We're bringing utilities down to the dock amenities as we put in new dock and new floats. Those type of amenities are absolutely essential for running boating and marine services. We're enhancing our restroom services. We're also enhancing some of our dock services so we can connect it to the mainland and create a very robust and integrated transportation system. In fact, most of the visitors coming to the fort will now have the opportunity in an event of this size and scale, gives us the ability to perfect a truly water-based public transportation system. That'll relieve the traffic congestion, which is a challenge in Newport, but it also enhances the public experience and access.
And I was struck when we started talking about America's Cup, what a huge push there was from the highest levels of state government, from Governor Chafee on down, to make the case to get it here. What was the thinking? Why was it so important, in the opinion of you and others there, to get this race?
I can tell you exactly what went on, and this was the exact leadership from the top. Governor Chafee, Senate President Piper Weed, Speaker of the House Gordon Fox were actively engaged in not just simply bringing the America's Cup World Series event to Rhode Island. It's a big event, it's an important event, but it was also the focus on the fact that one of the things that we can do well in our economy, and we've done well, is build upon the economies of Narragansett Bay, be it international sailing events, marine trade, which is one of the last competitive advanced manufacturing industries that we have within the state, the commercial fishing, the recreational boating, just general access and utilization of the bay. So we knew that an opportunity to build a state asset, which is Fort Adams, accelerate public improvements, attract a world-class event that every city, every country wants, bring it here, and get the proper attention on accelerating those improvements. Where we are today, quite frankly, we're not only going to have a really exciting and fun-filled week in America's Cup over the next several months, we now have the facilities in place which we've never had before, where we're now attracting back and identifying new sailing events, new sailing venues, and our goal is to turn Fort Adams State Park into a world-class sailing center. Today at the fort, you have the country's most renowned sail education training program of Sail Newport with Brad Reed. The fort itself has been largely restored. It is one of the most intact historic coastal fortifications in America. And now we have tours, we have access, we have programs. Our jazz and folk festivals are only expanding. So we now have literally a critical center for marine tourism-related activity at a state asset made available to the public.
Paul, these catamarans, these boats that race.
Yes.
these things really cook. How fast do these go? Talk about that.
The boats are 45 feet long. They weigh approximately 3,000 pounds with a 70-foot mast. The sail on them, which you know is really
It's
a
actually
wing.
light for a 45.
Yeah, it is very light.
Yeah.
It's very light. It's more actually aircraft wing than it is a real sail. The boats will probably do up to 30 knots with the right wind condition. The big advantage of these boats is they can sail in a very light wind. And you know, if you have 3 or 4 knots of wind, they can still get out there and race.
Usually not a problem for Narragansett Bay.
No, no. We don't see the wind being a problem. It's going to be a whole new spectator opportunity. Never have we had racing right in Narragansett Bay, right between Fort Adams and Jamestown. It'll bring a lot of the racing that people have never seen before, only seen on TV. A lot of them to you know, sit in bleachers and watch the race. It's a great event. The technology they have in the event is amazing.
I heard they're coming in on big container ships. Is that how they bring in the boats?
Yes. On June 11th, tentatively, there's a container ship arriving from Italy. That'll have the boats on it. It'll have about 130 containers that are all support equipment and support workshops. 85 of those containers will be trucked down to Fort Adams and set up to form the technical area. The boats will probably unload right at Quonset and tow them down. They also have probably about 40 to 50 support boats, besides the race boats.
Keith, and we should point out that this, for people who have lived in Rhode Island for a long time, this is not the America's Cup that we might have known as a kid, the big major America's Cup event. And I was talking to Ted before the show. I remember going to an America's Cup event when I was a kid, and it was spectacular. I mean, it's something I'll never forget. Do you ever foresee a time when the main event returns to Newport? I mean, can we compete with New Zealand, with Australia, with ports in Europe?
I think my goal has been, and what I've tried to articulate with the improvements of Fort Adams is to create a venue and a site where we can attract on an ongoing basis many national and international sailing events year to year, and versus trying to focus on a single event. The America's Cup, as it was when I was younger and you were younger, is a different entity. Those were 12 meters sailing far offshore. The media exposure, the activities were different. What we today recognize as the modern day America's Cup only began about in 1977 with Ted Turner in Newport. We got on the front page of Sports Illustrated, and all of a sudden it became an event that even us as land lovers wanted to be a part of.
Right.
Today it's changed even yet again. So our goal is not simply to bring back large scale events such as America's Cup, but to create an environment and to create an infrastructure to provide long-term investment. This is the most important stepping stone that we can do for Rhode Island, our sailing community, and our sailing event environment. What we have here in Rhode Island that no one else has, anywhere, and I can boast about this, the history of historic sailing is centered in Newport, in Rhode Island Sound. The history of, most importantly, some of the greatest sailors of the world is centered in Newport and Rhode Island Sound. We've got great weather, we've got great depth, we've got a very compact base. You can get a lot done in a very small, very well-managed footprint, unlike many other race courses and other locations around the country and the world. So the good news is, anybody and everyone that enjoys and loves sailing, either as an on-the-water sailor or as a spectator, they always come back to the fact is, if you had these basic amenities, Newport is our favorite place.
You know, Keith, I have to ask you, Governor, I remember when Governor Carcieri appointed you to run the EDC. Now, you've stayed on under Governor Chafee. The unemployment rate today, we hear 11.1%. Now, we joked before the show, we're going to say, why is it so high, Keith? It's your fault, right? But it's not so much that. It's more when you look out at the economy in Rhode Island, why are we missing the national recovery? Why are we having such a hard time even bringing it down to 9%?
The 11% is devastating, particularly for those that are still unemployed or unemployable, and I do take it personally, and it is a priority. Governor Chafee has made it absolutely a priority for us as we're developing a jobs cabinet and a jobs plan to begin to focus on the structural changes so that we can not only drive down that unemployment rate in the short term, but keep it down. But let me be frank, as we're just as concerned about the 11% unemployment rate, we're equally concerned of what we call the skills gap. There are a number of Rhode Islanders, unfortunately, that have little or no post-secondary education and skills to align around the new entrepreneurial technology that's arising in our capital city, the marine trade companies in Bristol and Portsmouth that are looking for tradesmen, the advanced manufacturing going on at Quonset, the financial services in Northern Rhode Island. We are creating private sector jobs. Not at the pace that we would like to see, and certainly not at the pace that we're seeing in New England and the country, but we are creating private sector jobs. The concern, the long-term concern is, how do we properly prepare all Rhode Islanders to have the right training and education to fill those jobs?
But I've been hearing that for years, and I'm sorry, we have 30 seconds left in the show. So how do you close that skills gap? Because we've doing this show for a long time. Everyone says that.
You need to have me back, and we'll have a whole show dedicated to this because it's a very detailed, comprehensive strategy that has short-term, immediately implementable strategies, and then some immediate and long-term, and it ties secondary and higher education into a pathway training program.
All right, we are out of time, and Paul, I did get a chance to tool around on the America's Cup World Series website, and there's a localized one for Rhode
Yes.
Island, and hats off. It was a very cool
great
website.
video. Great video.
Great video, and there's some apps on there too that you could fool around with, and some games to get kids involved. So
And do you have to pay to get into the events? How's that?
That's a good question.
There is a ticketing plan. They will announce it hopefully next week.
Okay.
All right. Well, and you know what? We'll put a link on the Newsmakers website to the America's Cup
Great.
events.
Appreciate that.
And to get that, you go to WPRI.com. Newsmakers is under the on-air section at the top of the website. I want to thank you for watching this week. We appreciate Paul Harden, Keith Stokes for joining us on the program. For WPRI.com reporter Ted Nisi, I'm Tim White. We'll see you next week on Newsmakers.